So the plan is, I wrote to Sinclair maybe about 3 months ago, and he answered, which was pretty remarkable, just giving us kind of 10 books that you'd recommend to someone thinking of Christian ministry, kind of the young pastor. And so he graciously replied, I'm also going to ask him to recommend a book that he hasn't read. And I'm going to start with just asking him, of the books that you've written yourself, what are the books that you've written that you've most enjoyed writing?
Enjoyed writing?
Or you think are most benefit for young pastors, those thinking of ministry?
Well, I can't answer the second question.
Okay.
I guess the first question is, I've probably enjoyed having written most of them. Writing is a kind of love-hate thing. Okay. Because to me it's an exercise in overcoming the sloth of my existence and getting the kind of malfunctioning electricity of the files in the computer in here into coherent order by the use of another computer. So enjoy is the afterburner rather than the experience of the moment. Actually, I enjoyed writing I think maybe the last book that was published, which was on the farewell discourse in John 13:17, probably for several reasons. One was because of how special the passage has been in my own life. And the other was because I very much felt when I was writing it that I was there. Okay. So in imagination, I wasn't quite caught up into the third heaven, but in imagination, it was all there. I was listening. I was there in Jerusalem. And I knew that when I'd pressed the send button, that I would probably be the only person in the universe who would experience that. Because I kind of felt it would be wonderful if even just some people who read this book, when reading it, felt they were there. And so that was one book where I think I couldn't imagine the experience of the book would be greater for anyone who ever read it than it was for me writing it. And that's not always true of books, because you're not writing them for yourself. I think quite a number of the books I've written, I've always had somebody sitting beside me in my imagination, and I'm writing for an individual. But I've also had, I think, in terms of why am I doing this, to write the kind of book that my friends, the few friends who actually read my books, might say to somebody who are in pastoral ministry, might say to somebody, I don't have 15 hours to explain this to you, but my friend has written this book on this subject. And if you'll read that, let's get together for an hour and a half afterwards, and I can correct his errors or mop up the. Good. So, I've really tried in my multi or schizophrenic personality, I've tried to write in service of the ministry of the church. Good. In some of the books, very evidently.
Let's get going on your recommendations. They're not in the order that you gave them to me, but select letters.
Yeah, maybe I can just say.
Take your time.
This list is very autobiographical. So it wasn't so much what 10 books would I recommend to somebody beginning in pastoral ministry, but I thought the question was, because I didn't really read your email, of course.
Or take the phone call.
I thought the question was something like, so So can you give us 10 books that, kind of have punctuated, made you who you are?
Great.
Yeah.
That's a great postmodernist answer. Great.
So,
select letters of John Newton.
Select letters of John Newton. You can't help loving John Newton. I was thinking about him this morning. Among the many things that were discarded this morning, as I was editing along what I was going to say, in the process of saying it, was one of the great sayings of John Newton. He says it in the meeting of the original eclectics, which may mean something for some of you of an Anglican background, with people like Newton and Simeon and others in it. He says at one point, my people will take anything from me because they know I mean to do them good and I love them. And I thought, that's a great thing for a minister to say. John Newton, I think, was probably a much better letter writer than he was a preacher. And I suspect he spent more time on his letters, wrote them very carefully. One of his friends in the eclectic meeting says of him, after he's spoken about his sermon preparation, he says, I hope there are no students who will follow your model. But he has this marvelous way of putting his finger on all kinds of pastoral issues. And of course, the letters are in the collected works, which I think are now in 4 volumes. But if you've never read Newton's letters, this is just a great place to start. And there are some of these letters I have often quoted, just because they're so very helpful. He has a lovely letter. Letter number 13 on divine guidance is one I've quite often encouraged young Christians to read, to clarify all the clutter that goes on from all the ways in which they're encouraged to hear God's will. And it's cheap. Not that would mean anything to a Scot.
Of course.
Pilgrim's Progress. Some well-meaning aunt must have given me a pop-up picture book version of Pilgrim's Progress, which is certainly the way to put any child off any book. But I reread it again when I was a student, and it just blew me away. And I've kind of basically been recommending it ever since. When, some of you know I was a minister in Columbia, South Carolina, not Colombia, but Columbia, South Carolina. And my friend Derek Thomas came to join me in the ministry team there. Not that we ever called it a team, but what would be called a ministry team here, I suppose. And I had sometimes said to the congregation, I think it may be possible to get into heaven without ever reading the Pilgrim's Progress, but if I were you, I wouldn't take that chance. I tried to smile when I was saying it, to communicate the message. And when Derek came, Derek is quite the expert in Pilgrim's Progress, quite the expert. I said, I'd like you to take Wednesday nights to take the congregation through Pilgrim's Progress. And the great thing is, I've told them they should read it as lovingly as I can, but I can be the marketing manager because I'm not saying, come and hear me on Pilgrim's Progress. And one thing I had noticed, I don't think this is as true in Britain, one thing I noticed is, one of the things Americans seem to find attractive, probably because of the nature of their educational system, if you tell them what they're going to learn, they'll be more interested than if you say, next week I'm going to begin a new series on Jeremiah. So here, he's going to begin a new series on Jeremiah. But there was this massive turnout. Those of you who need to leave for dinner in an hour's time, this was the South to me. So we had this huge fellowship hall that was like some London banqueting hall, beautiful place. It was absolutely jam-packed. There wasn't a seat in the place. A 97-year-old elder who usually did not manage out on Wednesday nights walked into the room. There wasn't a seat for him. Every single man in the room stood up to offer their seat to him, even people who were 100 yards away. And I thought, younger people think this is just, the old external politeness. But this was actually created by the lingering effects of the Old Testament commandment that you stand in the presence of the elderly and you show them honor. And I thought, this is such a great illustration of God. So back to the Pilgrim's Progress. So I sat through, I mean, I think it took Derek about a year to get through it. The thing that really kind of blew me away, because it was so unexpected to me, was how much he was teaching the congregation without any of them realizing what was happening. And I had never thought about the Pilgrim's Progress as a teaching tool. But if you're looking for the way to gather Americans to your congregation who need to know what they're going to learn, here's another thing. I remember I think this has happened to me more than once, but I remember a lady coming to me with her husband, and she had a particular burden, a kind of paralyzing burden. And as we were talking, I said to her, "Would you mind if I just leave for a moment?" No. So I went and I got my copy of Pilgrim's Progress. I sat down and said, "I want you to listen to this." And I read one particular passage that I knew intimately. And the woman left the room having light on her life that she'd never had before. She'd been to counseling, and I mean, it wasn't me. It was just, I thought, I think this will deliver this woman permanently. She will be up and down. You know, we're all up and down.
Yeah.
But to me, it was a tremendous illustration of the value of the book.
We've read it on Sunday nights during our children's talks for the last kind of 6 weeks. And
you're still in the slough of despond.
No, we're not. We're not in that children's version. And but there have been no comments on the sermons. And yet everybody said, "Oh, the children's talks have been great the last 6 weeks." Mystery of Providence.
Mystery of Providence is just a great book. It's a terrific... that's embarrassing. It's a terrific illustration, I think, of Puritan preaching that takes a text as a departure point into a doctrine. And occasionally comes back to it. And I don't suppose any of us would preach this way. But it's also a fabulous illustration of a man who was tremendously committed to his congregation. I mean, all kinds of stories about Flavel during the dark days after the ejection of, believe it or not, disguising himself as a woman to go and preach somewhere. But the interesting thing is, you know, we're all told by these horrible people who teach hermeneutics that when it comes to homiletics, you need illustrations. And, you know, sure you do need illustrations. And Jesus told illustrations. Why don't you tell? Jesus told parables, not illustrations. Okay, some of us are hopeless at illustrations. But every one of us has ways of illustrating if we'll just open our eyes. And Flavel was actually a master of that. Both in some of the... I mean, there is one narrative in this book that the congregation must have been sitting on the edge of their seats, where he talks about a young ship's surgeon who has attempted suicide. And Flavel is called. And if you want to know what happened, read The Mystery of Providence. This is, you know, if you haven't got this book, then shame on you. Murray McShane, his friend Andrew Bonner, bosom friend, every single anniversary of McShane's death, Bonner remembers in his diary what that friendship meant, reflected on, is he waiting for me? Do they wait for us in heaven? Do they know? And I think I would say no biography has had as much of an effect, and probably no dead preacher has had as much of an effect on me as Robert Murray McShane. So I just owe him from my teenage years, you know.
We only have one copy of this Communion with God, but we can get copies in, and they can be sent to you free of charge.
Yeah, Communion with God. This is the baby version that's been dumbed down for Paul's children's addresses on Sunday night. After Pilgrim's Progress, he's going to read Communion with God to them. I would say this is probably John Owen's greatest work, and one of the greatest pieces of applied theology in the English language. And in my list of books, I would say this is one of the top 5 books that's made an impact on my life. I just happened to be blessed by being, I think I was 17 when Owen's works started being reprinted. And I was able to buy my copies. I think they were brought out 4 volumes every 3 months, and I bought the whole set, I think, for £16. No, it was less than that. It must have been £12. They were selling them for 15 shillings each in old money. And when I discovered, and those were days when, Owen was being rediscovered, and you were supposed to read The Death of Death and The Death of Christ so you could slay Arminians right, left, and center, and people did. Or to read Mortification of Sin so you could slay yourself right and left, and people tried but failed. And in a way, it was a second Owen blessing to me to discover this book, because this was positive exposition of the Blessed Trinity and our fellowship with God with respect to the offices of each person of the Trinity, and how no book more enlarged my sense of what communion with God is than.
And he died in Ealing.
He died in the leafy village of Ealing in 1683.
So isn't that a great thing?
Yes. Westminster Confession and Commentary. The Westminster Confession has been one of a small number of documents that's really framed how I think. And the more I read it, the more I realized this was put together by men, largely by men who were engaged in pastoral ministry. There were some fishy characters at the Westminster Assembly, but the dominant positive men were pastors. And sometimes you can sense, because the Westminster Confession is a committee document, you can almost sense in some of these chapters that, one of these 17th century geezers said, I've just finished preaching a series of 10 sermons on Providence. And another geezer says, well, what was your outline? And another geezer says, that would make a good start for this chapter. And when I was a teenager, I came across Hodges' Commentary. And I'm not sure it's probably not the best commentary on the confession that will ever be written. It's very ahistorical. So it treats the confession by and large as though it had fallen straight from heaven. Which of course it did, but it went through London in the process. I think this is just a great place to help you mine the riches of the confession. And it's a beautiful combination of theology and practicality. So no living theologian, I think, has meant more to me than John Murray. So again, I have to go back to my teenage years. I think I had the second John Murray blessing the first time I heard him speak when I was a teenager. And it was in the graduation chamber of the university, which was a beautiful room with wood paneling all the way around. And I was sitting there, and I felt when he was speaking that he came over to me. He was a very affectionate man and said, "Son, you come with me," and took me to the wall behind him and said, "You were watching that wall before I started speaking, but you didn't notice that one of these panels has a handle on the outside. unlike Holman Hunt, there was the handle on the outside. I'm going to open that door and I'm going to show you what's behind the wall. It was a remarkable experience. And so I've always, and this, which isn't so well known these days, is originally lectures he gave at Fuller Seminary, I think, on the Christian ethic. And what he does is really try and mine the creation ordinances. And my own view is that has been a tremendous lack in general evangelicalism. I mean, away what Jonty was saying, substitutionary atonement is important, but it's not the whole thing. And it has left generations of evangelicals with a gospel that has no rooting in creation. And Murray, I think he was, in the 1950s, this was really a groundbreaking book. And in a way, he does in his own way as a theologian what Johnny was doing this afternoon, saying, well, let's go back to see what is crafted in the scriptures and think biblically. So I think very warmly of this.
You wrote about John Murray on Romans. That's the one copy we've got. It's out of print until next year, and so it's available for £20. Tell us about it, John Murray on Romans.
Well, so again, some of these reasons for these books are very personal. This is personal because it was Professor Murray, because I bought it with some of the money I got. This is a bit self-aggrandizing, but some of the money I got one year from the philosophy department. And I still remember the kind of absolute delight I had when I handed over some of the money to buy Murray and Romans, thinking if the members of the philosophy department knew what I was doing with the money, they would be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And it was just at a point in my life, I guess I was 18 at the time, and it had dawned on me one day, I know exactly where I was sitting, that while all scripture was inspired, the whole Bible was also structured. And therefore I needed to place special study focus on the books that in a sense sustained the whole. And obviously, I had enough nous to know Romans was one of them. And that was, and it'll be out next year in a new edition. This is, Dr. Lloyd-Jones, a total piece of history. And we're in a new era now where people don't know Dr. Lloyd-Jones. And it's just either in this or in the one volume, which is an abridged version, but it's got some very interesting stuff in it that's not in this. I especially... Martin Lloyd-Jones. Biography by Ian Murray. 2 volumes. I think I enjoyed volume 1 more.
Definitely.
I think probably I would say the same about John Stott's biography. And maybe it is because I really believe it's much more important for us when we are younger to look at what was happening to men when they were younger and not look even to the books that they are now reading. Because the books that they are now reading ain't the books that made them what they were and what they became. It's the books that they were reading at our stage when we're younger that framed their way of thinking. So that's that. This, Institutes of Christian Religion, I think number 1 book in framing the way I think. Especially books 1, 2, and 3. And bits of book 4. I think especially on the Lord's Supper. But book 1, just the extent to which one thinks about the world today in terms of the spectral lenses of Romans 1:18 to 32, which I think Ford Lewis Battles thought may have been the passage that really transformed Calvin's life. So very much appreciative of that. Book 2 on Christ. One of the few passages I have bothered to retranslate out of Calvin's Latin is that passage at the end of his exposition of Christ in the clauses of the Apostles' Creed, which really should be turned into a hymn, which is so full of something Jonty was touching on, that the work of Christ doesn't take place either outside or apart from him. Yeah. It's not something out there, abstractable from him. It's embodied in him. And that leads Calvin into union with Christ. And those marvelous opening sections when he says at the beginning of Book 3, Christ can have done all of this and it be of no value to you unless you're united to him. And then his really extraordinary exposition of union with Christ, in which he kind of essentially delays his discussion of justification in the context of the Roman polemic to emphasize that justification never takes place apart from union with Christ, and therefore can never take place apart from sanctification. And like the other reformers, he saw then that what needed to happen in the medieval Ordo Salutis was that what was left to the end of that Ordo Salutis, justification on the basis of what has been wrought in you that makes you justifiable, all that needed to be totally overturned. And he does a great job of that without kind of as much as saying that's what he's doing in Book 3. So it's great.
The last one of your books.
Work of the Pastor by Mr. Still. It's a one-off. He was a total one-off. But he was my minister when I was a student. And, this is very autobiographical. I remember when, I don't know, it was maybe about 20. No, it was probably 21. I was so shy. I sat listening to him for 18 months without speaking to him until one night I walked behind him and he put out his hand and he hauled me round and said, "When are you going to come and speak to me?" And I, shuddering, said, I didn't know I could come and speak to you, Mr. Still. "Oh, yes." And that taught me something. He'd been watching me for 18 months. He knew all about me. And especially when I was in bigger congregations, where you couldn't really get to know everybody to the same degree, it put into me the understanding you can get to know people much better than they would ever imagine by keeping your eyes and your ears open. And you can learn a tremendous amount about people just by being alert within the congregation. Anyway, so one day he gave me something, and I jokingly said to him, "This is the first thing you've ever given me," which was true physically, but not spiritually. I said, "You should autograph it." And he gave it back to me, and he said, "I don't want to write my autograph there." And he poked me in the chest. He said, "I want to write my autograph there." And I thought, what a goal for ministry that you would do that through your ministry of the Word. And what a commitment to have made to doing it, that you could actually say that to somebody and look them in the eye. Yeah. So this is an energizer book, I think. Yeah. And many people who, weren't in my position of knowing him, I think, have found that to be true, Paul.
And the last book, which you've not read, and I wanted you to, why should people read Jeff Thomas's autobiography? Jeff's not here, but this is being recorded, so you'll see it, I think.
Why? What would be a suitable pause, as though this were a difficult question? Well, one reason why is he's just given me a free copy. Well, let me kind of be autobiographical again. So in April, I was out at Reformed Seminary in Dallas teaching a course on the church. And I walk into the classroom at the beginning of the afternoon session, and Jeff Thomas is sitting there with a local minister who has brought him down. So they both come to hear my lecture on the church. They were both Baptists. Now, if I'd been lecturing on baptism, I might have carried on at that point. But I thought, this is about the church, and this man is somewhere in his 80s, was for more than 50 years minister of the same church. It is almost impossible that the men sitting in this room will ever be in the presence of someone like that again. And I thought, away with my lectures. So I said, Jeff, would you mind if I interview you? So my interview, my questions began to be slanted to the church, because I've got a conscience. I'm actually getting paid to do this. The students, and the thing that really, it kind of blew me out of the water was just how full of Christ the conversation was for the next hour and a half or 2 hours, just flowing. And for a man to have been in the ministry for more than 50 years and still to be near enough the waters to be leafy and green. I'm pretty sure the students thought that was the best bit of the course. And I'm just assuming that something of that flow is in the book. And even if there are some streams of that flow, it's well worth reading. And also because he's someone who has lived through, like in the States, they speak about people as the new Calvinists. And they actually, when they say that, they don't know when the, quotes, new Calvinists began. The new Calvinists are the people who should never have become Calvinists, but did, by one way or another. In other words, they weren't brought up under the aegis of, a Reformed church or anything like that. But Jeff was part of the kind of sweep in the United Kingdom in the late 50s, early 60s of the beginnings of the new Calvinism. And so he's just one of those people who's he's a piece of walking history. And I think it's always helpful for us to reflect on what God did through men in order that he might do something through us. Because often they did not have the same advantages that we have. Now, Jeff went to Westminster Seminary, which in his day was a huge step to take, so he had a very strong theological education with many of the original faculty. But, he was a student in a day when, years before I was a student, and when I was a student, most of the books that helped me really had been written by the Westminster faculty. It was a pretty small marketplace. Now, you can't move for high quality evangelical and Reformed literature. And it's very easy to take that for granted. So I think there's just so much that you can learn from somebody who is 2 generations before you, not just 1 generation before you, but 2 generations. So I'm looking forward to reading this on the way back.
Thank you very much.
Thank
indeed.
you, Paul.